you so much. I'm so happy to be here with you tonight. I'm going to talk a little bit about Springsteen and also some other singer-songwriters. And since some of the lyrics are maybe not at the top of your brain, like of course all the Springsteen lyrics, there's a handout that gives you some lyrics in case you want to read a little more of some of these that I'm going to refer to. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about how Bruce Springsteen became what T.S. Eliot refers to as a mature poet. And where I get that phrase, mature poet, is, well, T.S. Eliot, in discussing how poets borrow from other authors, he makes a distinction between immature and mature poets according to how they integrate the work of others into their own creations. And he remarks that a mature poet welds his theft into a whole of feeling which is unique, utterly different from that which it was torn, and will usually borrow from authors remote in time or alien in language or diverse in interest. And that's the first item on your handout. But before I get to that, a little terminology to just clarify. So in talking about American folk music, I'm going to use the term tradition, which I'm sure you all are familiar with. In its broadest sense, refers to something handed down, usually from one generation to the next. And in contrast to that, we have originality. And originality denotes that which is revolutionary or new, or which is a departure from what has come before. So this is the basic contrast. That which is original doesn't come from something else. And what T.S. Eliot's mature poet is doing is creating a point of contact between those seemingly disparate ideas. We have originality within a tradition. So we're putting an artist in dialogue with what has come before. To achieve this type of originality, an artist must do two things. First, he must place him or herself within a tradition in a way that will be recognizable to his or her audience, and two, engage that tradition in such a way as to say something new. Throughout his career as a songwriter, Springsteen has worked within musical traditions in a way that acknowledges their influence and at the same time creates something new. And that encourages his audience then to reflect upon the tradition and perhaps even see it from a new perspective. In looking at Springsteen as a mature poet, I want to consider two moments in Springsteen's decades-long discourse with the folk tradition. His most overt inclusion of folk material, the Seeger sessions, and then the beginnings of that engagement with the folk tradition in the river in Nebraska. These works illustrate several different ways in which Springsteen creates a dialogue with the folk tradition, with specific works in that tradition, in order to offer that distinctive perspective. So the audience also has to participate, so they can make meaning from Springsteen songs by placing them into a tradition, recognizing the earlier works that inform the lyrics, and considering the effect the tradition has on Springsteen's work, and in turn the effect that has on their understanding of the tradition itself. Now there are lots of other Springsteen albums I could talk about that draw on the folk tradition. Of course, The Ghost of Tom Joad and Devils and Dust come to mind. But what I want to do tonight is give a little bit more of a focused look at a few things. So there's certainly books could be written on this, but we only have limited time. So I'm going to limit myself to sort of the beginnings and then the fullest realization of that engagement with the folk tradition. So let's start at the end. Let's start with the Seeger sessions, because that's where Springsteen really most clearly engages the folk tradition, the Seeger sessions, album, and tour. Even before the audience encounters a single lyric of the Seeger sessions, the album title refers them to Pete Seeger. This is a clear indication of genre. As the Seeger sessions band takes the stage at each concert, they and their instruments visually signal that this is going to be a different type of music because it requires different performers and different sounds. So those aspects of the album and the performance, even though they're not lyrics, are still a form of reference. They evoke a particular source. In addition, the title, the music, the instruments, these are sort of what we could call a programmatic statement. They indicate that the work is part of the folk genre and is going to thus adhere to conventions that are different from those of rock music. Remember that folk music is a process as well as a genre. Its mode of composition is dynamic. A song is not so much a product as part of a multiplicity of versions. The term sessions in the title of the album really points us to that aspect of folk music. It implies performance as a part, with collaboration as an active part. And the recording of an album, of course, is something that generally involves multiple sessions. And maybe those sessions are actually part of the creative process with the composition evolving over that course. So putting that word sessions in the title makes us think of process as well as the finished product. And the trying out of different things, right? This reminds us of improvisation. And as we know from some things Springsteen has said in interviews about the recording of the Seeger sessions, there was a good amount of improvisation in recording that album. He mentions purposely recording the songs without a whole lot of rehearsal so their performances would have a sense of spontaneity. So in this sense, the final product is actually a glimpse of what would usually be part of the music making process that would then maybe lead to a polished final version. During the Seeger Sessions tour, Springsteen uses a mode of composition that Pete Seeger identified as the hallmark of a folk tradition, making new versions of traditional songs. Seeger himself calls attention to that phenomenon when he introduces the song If I Had a Hammer on the Clearwater Classics album. He says, "There are a number of different versions of this song, but they all harmonize together." In fact, Seeger drew criticism for actually interfering with that very folk process, because he made the songs that he sang so popular that his version actually crowded out other versions. And now the Pete Seeger version is kind of the one that people think of, even though songs like If I Had a Hammer certainly had many other versions. But his were played very widely on radio, and some of the others got forgotten. So this really, again, underscores that idea that folk is a process. It's not a static corpus or a canon. Songs are going to change with every performance, and they're going to evolve to remain relevant to cultural changes. So they're going to incorporate new lyrics, perhaps referring to current events. So if you look at handout number 2, you can see an example of that. So we have here an example, what we're going to look at is an example of a cover version that adds new verses, new lyrics. And so the song is, "How Can a Poor Man Stand Such Times and Live and Bring Him Home?" Springsteen does this in both of those songs. Poor Man was written by blind Alfred Reed in 1929. It was an early protest song about the Great Depression. Springsteen takes just one verse from that version and actually then attaches onto it a whole new song. So Springsteen's new verses transform the song from a protest against the government during the Great Depression to a protest against the government response to Hurricane Katrina. Blind Alfred Reed's version clearly references the events of the Great Depression. There are numerous vignettes in the song. He mentions the high price of food and clothing, poor quality of schools, fines when children didn't attend those schools, police brutality, and it's all tied together with that refrain, "How can a poor man stand such times and live?" These examples maybe even feel very timely today. Rising prices of essentials like food remind us of things like economic inequality, and of course declining quality of education is something that gets talked about a lot, especially inequalities in terms of the quality of education in lower income areas. And the line, "Officers kill without a cause," we feel like maybe that could have been written just very recently. This ultimate loss of power, the loss of life itself, is disproportionately imposed on the poor. And the last verse underscores the futility of the situation. Even the person who's supposed to help, the doctor, does nothing. Like the deceptive stake in the preceding verse, things might seem good on the surface. The doctor says, "In a little while you'll be all right." But there's no substance. The pill is humbug, and the price is inflated, as he says, a great big bill. If you look at handout number 3, you see Springsteen's cover, but it's really his own version of this song. Now Springsteen starts with the final verse, "Well, the doctor comes around," and he makes it the beginning of his song. With this opening, he's clearly referring his audience to a specific locus. And he expects them to recall that context, the Great Depression, but then apply that to a different event. Because Springsteen then adds original verses. But he keeps the refrain, how can a poor man stand such time and live? So the new verses, they preserve that tone of the protest song, but they change the topic. The message is updated to apply to a recent catastrophe, Hurricane Katrina. Details like Canal Street, the levees, relocations to Texas, those are what clue us that this is Katrina he's talking about. But the lesson is the same as in Reed's song. Economic circumstance influences one's destiny. Being poor exposes a person to other hazards. The line, them who's got out of town, them who ain't got left to drown, really puts that message across. Although Springsteen keeps Reed's doctor verse almost verbatim, the new context actually changes its meaning. For Reed, the doctor could be an actual physician, similar to other characters in his lyrics, and also may, given his placement in the song's final verse, be a metaphor for the ineffectual remedies that come along in a financial crisis. For Springsteen, though, the significance of the doctor develops as the song progresses. The first and most immediate function of Springsteen's opening verse is to identify the song's origin in Reed's composition. He literally picks up where Reed left off. Springsteen's second verse, however, reveals that the doctor in his version is to be identified with George W. Bush. The words the he of verse 2 speaks are nothing but a humbug pill, and their content allows the readers to identify the speaker as President Bush. The reference to high times in his youth evokes Bush's history of substance abuse. The I'm with you actually is a direct quote from Bush's speech in Poplarville, Mississippi on September 5th, 2005. Bush's words, like the doctor's pill, qualify as humbug. They're something deceptive. The implication is that Bush, like the doctor, is someone who does not fulfill the promise of his title. The implicit comparison of Hurricane Katrina to another tragic event from American history, the Great Depression, draws a parallel between those events that highlights both the plight of the poor and the response of the powerful. If you look at number 4 on your handout, you see that in the final verse, Springsteen adds another line that's a reference. Yeah, and I ain't got no home in this world no more. This is almost an exact quote of the refrain of Woody Guthrie's I Ain't Got No Home. The quote is also a self-reference, however, because Springsteen covered that Guthrie song in 1988 on the Folkways tribute to Woody Guthrie and Leadbelly. So the reference may serve as a reminder of Springsteen's earlier interest in Guthrie's songs. The lyric itself is from Guthrie's Dust Bowl Ballads. While the significance of the connection may not seem obvious at first, it's made clear during live performances of Poor Man. At Seeger Sessions concerts, Springsteen talked about Hurricane Katrina and mentioned many times that that Hurricane Katrina was the cause of the biggest displacement of people since the Dust Bowl. So there he's really cluing the audience to think about Woody Guthrie. So it might seem, just reading the lyrics, like this is an incidental inclusion of a Woody Guthrie line, but it's actually quite a pointed reference. When we look at that Woody Guthrie song, we see the context from which that line, I ain't got no home in this world anymore, comes, is actually a really good fit with Reed's song. Guthrie points out many of the same problems faced by a poor man. In the first verse, the police make it hard, recalls Reed's officers kill without a cause. Guthrie's rich man took my home and drove me from my door. My crops I lay into the banker's store. Resembles Reed's that's what keep the poor man always in a hole. We can hardly get our breath, taxed and schooled and preached to death. Both songwriters conclude that it's all but impossible to escape poverty. Moving on to handout number 5, I want to look a little bit at Bring Them Home. Now in Bring Them Home, Springsteen takes as his primary model a Pete Seeger song written in response to a historical event, the Vietnam War, and he alters it to make it a more universal anti-war song. Seeger makes it explicit in his lyrics that he's writing about Vietnam. He mentions the place in the first verse. That's actually an interesting verse. The refrain makes the listeners hear the other lines perhaps differently than they would otherwise. If you just read the lines, "If you love your Uncle Sam, support our boys in Vietnam," that might appear to be a pro-military lyric. But the refrain, bring them home," suggests that the way to really support the troops is to end the war and bring them home. So, flipping the meaning. Just when we think that we understand this anti-war song, Seeger again shows us some complexity. As he goes on in the song, we get this kind of an interesting line. "There's one thing I must confess, I'm not really a pacifist. If an army invaded this land of mine, you'd find me out on the firing line." Seems pretty surprising in a protest song. This admission that some wars must be fought makes Bring Them Home a little bit anomalous in the protest genre. Like the explicit reference to Vietnam, this verse clearly positions the song as a response to one war in particular, as opposed to a general anti-war protest song. And Seeger also offers a solution: more education. This is a practical and pragmatic look at war, rather than an idealistic condemnation. Seeger's lyrics really capture a moment, and the song becomes an important historical document. But it may lack some immediacy, perhaps for listeners born after the Vietnam War. So we look at handout number 6, and this is Springsteen's version of that song. Now, Springsteen, in "How Can a Poor Man Stand Such Times and Live," makes reference to another specific event, but a more recent one. In "Bring 'Em Home," he takes away the specifics of the Vietnam War, and in fact universalizes the song. His lyrics maybe evoke the Iraq War. There's no explicit identification in the song itself. The word Vietnam is replaced with the more general overseas. And he leaves it to the audience maybe to interpret that. But when he would introduce the song in concert, he did explicitly connect it to the Iraq War. So we know that that's at least one possible interpretation. Springsteen also shortens the song and sharpens the focus to bringing the troops home. Springsteen's version has 7 verses in contrast to Seeger's 11. And Springsteen leaves out some of the themes, such as instances in which war might be justified, the importance of education. So Seeger really anchors his song in a time and place, but Springsteen has a more universal anti-war message. The textual references to Seeger's composition are to those lines that treat war in general terms, and they come early in the song, establishing the connection before departing from the model. Springsteen nearly quotes Seeger's, "It will make our generals sad, I know, they want to tangle with the foe," but he broadens the sentiment. He replaces generals with politicians and the foe with their foe, perhaps implying that the decisions of war are now even further removed from the battlefield. It's politicians, not generals, who are making the calls. And the enemy is no longer ours as a nation, but specifically the enemy, the politicians, their foe, the enemy they want eliminated. Reinforcing this reading is Springsteen's omission of Seeger's verses in which he declares himself not really a pacifist and allows that there are circumstances in which he would fight. Springsteen simply calls for an end to war. In a post-Vietnam and post-9/11 world, Bring 'Em Home looks back to its roots in the folk tradition as a protest song, but it takes that theme beyond a specific protest, perhaps looking ahead to future performances in which it will unfortunately describe new wars. Look at handouts numbers 7 and 8 for this next bit. In the second half of Bring 'Em Home, Springsteen includes several references to When Johnny Comes Marching Home. Springsteen says the men will cheer and the boys will shout, yeah, and we will all turn out, and that closely resembles the opening verse of When Johnny Comes Marching Home. In verse 7 of Bring 'Em Home, Springsteen includes the title lyric, yeah, When Johnny Comes Marching Home. This really makes the allusion impossible to miss. The upbeat tone of When Johnny Comes Marching Home might seem to be a departure from the more somber first half of Bring 'Em Home, but When Johnny Comes Marching Home actually has its own complex history. The American song, which was published during the Civil War, is based on an Irish anti-war song that dates to around 1800. The upbeat tone of the American version actually reverses the tragic story of the Irish Johnny I Hardly Knew Ye. in which Johnny returns from war disabled, and his wife almost doesn't recognize him. Perhaps Springsteen has the darker antecedent of When Johnny Comes Marching Home in mind when he references it in a song that brings out the cost of war in a way that's more reminiscent of Johnny I Hardly Knew Ye. Poor Man and Bring 'Em Home, despite their new verses, are recognizable as covers. There's another category of songs that have clear antecedents and yet can be considered original compositions. We could think of American Land from the Seeger sessions in that category. Even though not from the Seeger sessions, somewhat similar time period of composition, Land of Hope and Dreams serves as a helpful comparison. While Springsteen's Poor Man and Bring 'Em Home place the traditional in a new context, American Land and Land of Hope and Dreams adapt their models, with the result that they open a dialogue with those antecedents. Look at handouts 9 and 10 for lyrics to correspond to this next part. In American Land, Springsteen takes elements from Pete Seeger's He Lies in the American Land and radically alters the tone and the tune. In 1947, Andrew Cavalli taught Pete Seeger a song he had written in Slovakian called I Lie in the American Land. In that song, Cavalli describes a man who came to Pittsburgh from Slovakia, saved enough money to send for his family by working in a mine, but died in the mine before his family arrived. Seeger created an English version of the song, changing the title only slightly to He Lies in the American Land. Springsteen's version begins with an unmistakable verbal reference, what is this land of America? And so he clearly identifies that antecedent, which directs readers to recall the context of that earlier work, but subsequent details serve as a counterpoint to that source. This next bit, look at handout 11 and 12 for lyrics. Springsteen, like Seeger, acknowledges the hardships faced by immigrants, but Springsteen accentuates opportunity rather than tragedy. And so he really reverses the message of the song. The America of American Land is characterized by symbols of prosperity: silk, satin, gold, diamonds, a beer tap that never runs dry. And the key to this prosperity, work, is readily available. In Seeger's song, the promise of a new life in America is broken when the man who goes off to seek his fortune is dead by the time his wife joins him in their new home. Only his grave, his blood did she find. Springsteen's song is more forward-looking, and there's no suggestion that the song's main character meets a tragic end. The dangers faced by immigrants are cataloged in general terms. The costs of being an immigrant, hazardous job locations, including railroads, fields, and factories, appear in only one stanza, and they're the workplace of an unspecified they. Thus, the tragedy is not personalized and allows for a tone that is, on balance, quite optimistic. In contrast, Seeger's song leaves the listener with the image of a wife widowed and children orphaned. This part of the song that Springsteen makes personal is quite optimistic. In the third verse, he catalogs immigrants, and he includes the Zerillis, the surname of his mother's family, as well as the Irish and Italians, a nod to his ancestry. The upbeat tempo Springsteen employs also contributes to the song's optimism. Seeger's lyrics, however, are set to a spare and mournful tune, so you have a very different emotional effect from listening to these two compositions. The change Springsteen makes to the lyrics reinforce that change in tone. Rather than lying in the American land, Springsteen's character, as the refrain emphasizes, makes his home there. In this way, Springsteen can evoke Seeger as a model, but yet present a view of American immigration that is, on balance, optimistic. The audience, if they're familiar with Seeger's song, is invited to perhaps consider a dialogue between these two works, weighing the risks of leaving one's homeland for a new place with the potential rewards of those new opportunities. Like so many Springsteen songs, American Land contains both light and darkness, both triumph and tragedy. A parallel example is Springsteen's Land of Hope and Dreams, and that's handout number 13. The song is based on This Train, also known as This Train is Bound for Glory, which exists in many versions with various lyrics. The earliest known version is from 1922, but all the versions employ a list format. This train is bound for glory. If you ride it, you must be holy. This train don't pull no gamblers, and so forth, listing various types of sinners the train does not pull. Woody Guthrie's version is representative. The theme is salvation for the righteous, and the essential characteristic of the train is one of selection. Gamblers, liars, conmen, hustlers, all those, they're excluded. Only the righteous and holy are eligible to be passengers. Springsteen's train in Land of Hope and Dreams, on the other hand, is one of inclusion, and those lyrics are in handout 14. The saints are there in Springsteen's version, but so are the sinners, as well as the whores, the gamblers, the losers, the winners. They're all on board. They all have to take the ride together. While Guthrie's version evokes salvation for the worthy, if we see a suggestion of an afterlife in Springsteen's composition, the implication is that we're all heading there together. In concert, Springsteen often combines Land of Hope and Dreams with a partial cover of Curtis Mayfield's People Get Ready. See handout 15 for that. Mayfield's song also refers to the exclusion of sinners, but the portion Springsteen uses, the first verse, speaks only of inclusion. Mayfield is responsible for the line, "Don't need no baggage, just get on board, don't need no ticket." When we view Land of Hope and Dreams with its predecessors, Springsteen's message of inclusivity really stands out. The song not only underlies the theme of connection that runs through so much of his catalog, but it's in fact a polemic. It engages a debate that's central to the idea of America. Historian Brian Garman identifies the late 1970s as a critical moment in Springsteen's development as a writer. And I think if we look to this period, it can tell us some things about what we've been looking at in the lyrics we've seen so far. At this time in the mid-70s, he began working with John Landau. By the late 70s, John Landau was having quite an influence, and Landau, who was trained as a historian, encouraged Springsteen to broaden his reading and listening and exposed him to authors like John Steinbeck and Flannery O'Connor. And Springsteen was listening to a lot of Johnny Cash and Hank Williams at that time as well. So those things were definitely in Springsteen's mind in the late 70s. And I think we can see some of these ideas actually beginning to come out as we get to albums like The River and Nebraska. Certainly Woody Guthrie is also a major influence. So we see a lot of these things kind of coming together. We see a lot more pessimism on these earlier ones, and perhaps some of those literary influences are to thank for that. Characters like Johnny 99, characters who've lost their connection with their community, but their horrible acts in some sense are the consequence of circumstance, like Tom Joad, who killed a man and said he would do it again if he had to do over. There are characters who say, "I got debts no honest man can pay," and "there's just a meanness in this world." They accept that they've done wrong, but do not indicate that they would have made a different choice given the chance. Like Flannery O'Connor's "A Good Man is Hard to Find," these views of crime and punishment make us think about original sin. As the misfit in the O'Connor story says, "I found out the crime don't matter. You can do one thing or you can do another. Kill a man, take a tire off his car, because sooner or later you're going to forget what it was you'd done and just be punished for it." Which is about as satisfying an explanation for evil as "there's just a meanness in this world." Johnny Cash and Hank Williams project a similarly pessimistic worldview. Both have been identified with a subgenre known as outlaw country music. Lyrics like "I shot a man in Reno just to watch him die" would be at home on Nebraska. In addition to literary and musical influences, contemporary events also prompted uncertainty and a loss of trust. Thinking particularly of the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979, this is an event that really sparked Springsteen's political awakening. Deemed the result of unanticipated multiple failures, the incident undermined confidence not only in nuclear power, but also in the institutions that are supposed to keep us safe. The confluence of American literature, folk and country music, and political engagement can be seen in much of Springsteen's art. It was a perfect combination. Folk was a natural medium in which to explore the political and cultural forces that shaped the lives of his characters, a theme that surfaces in some songs on the river and certainly pervades Nebraska. Between the River and Nebraska, in November of 1980, Springsteen received a copy of Joe Klein's Woody Guthrie, A Life. This book marked Springsteen's full initiation into the American folk tradition. Klein presents a complete portrait of Guthrie in all his complexity. Like a character on Nebraska, Guthrie suffered greatly. By the time he was 15, he had seen his sister killed in a fire and his mother committed to a mental hospital. But he also imposed suffering on others. Klein describes him as a bad husband, a neglectful father, and a difficult friend. In the song The River, recorded in July or August of 1979, Springsteen creates a story that is at once universal and personal. The song's stark lyrics and melancholy folk ballad melody create a timeless feel, while the story draws inspiration from Springsteen's own sister's life. Springsteen's sister Virginia, Ginny, became pregnant as a high school senior and quickly married the child's father, Mickey Shave, who took a construction job to support the family. Springsteen debuted The River at the No Nukes concert in September of 1979, interestingly choosing it over the also recently written Roulette. Roulette was more topical, as it confronted the 3 Mile Island accident. But like The River, Roulette took a big theme, nuclear disaster in Roulette, job insecurity in the case of The River, and made it personal. Roulette actually doesn't include the words nuclear or 3 Mile Island, it just describes the effect on one family. If you remember, it begins with the lines, "We left the toys out in the yard." The River captures a similar sense of precariousness and lack of control. A line like, "Lately there ain't been much work on account of the economy," describes the economic impact of deindustrialization in the 1970s. In this way, the personal can become political, but those larger political and cultural realities are not really made explicit in the song, they reside between the lines. It's left to the listener to make that connection. No Nukes marked a turning point for Springsteen. He participated, but his political reticence was apparent. He was the only artist who did not make a statement about nuclear energy in the concert program, an omission Springsteen biographer Dave Marsh attributes to Springsteen not wanting to speak about an issue on which he did not consider himself fully informed. After No Nukes, Springsteen took it upon himself to become better informed about current events, and he began to speak out on political issues at his concert. One of the first times was in 1980. The day after Reagan won the presidency, Springsteen, performing at Arizona State University, introduced the song Badlands by saying, "I don't know what you guys think about what happened last night, but I think it's pretty frightening." Even with a biographical narrative, Springsteen connects The River to an earlier tradition with his lyrics, and this is handout 17. Hank William Jr. has a song, Long Gone Lonesome Blues, that you see there. While The River might seem at first glance to be a rather depressing song, the hope hidden in its lyrics becomes even more evident when you see it next to Long Gone Lonesome Blues. Williams' composition is a dark comedy about a failed suicide attempt. The cause of despair, lost love. In Springsteen's song, connection with the loved one persists and is actually a source of hope. For Williams, the river that has gone dry stymies his attempt to drown himself. "I got to the river so lonesome I wanted to die. Then I jumped in the river, but the doggone river was dry." Springsteen's river, when dry, is both a symbol of lost hopes and a reminder of a happier past, a combination that's somehow at the same time both comforting and tragic. The verbal echoes, "Down to the river was dry," are specific enough to evoke Williams' song, and listeners who get the reference are rewarded with insight into the Springsteen song's male character, who implicitly rejects the exit suicide could offer. Comparison with Williams' song emphasizes the fact that Springsteen's character still has a connection to his partner, while in Williams' song, she's long gone. At the end of the Springsteen song, the woman is still there, as the line, "Down to the river we ride," affirms. On the album Nebraska, connection to the folk tradition comes in yet another form, one that is organic to the album's creation. Hoping to speed up the recording process in the studio, Springsteen made a demo of the album at home by taping himself singing the songs, accompanied only by an acoustic guitar. In the studio, it was impossible to create as appropriate a backdrop for those songs as the extemporaneous feel Springsteen achieved in his home recording, complete with occasional creaking of the chair. This is not surprising because at its heart, Nebraska is a folk album, and that home recording process perfectly captures the folk recording process, the performative aspect of it. Springsteen's recordings of himself evoke the work of ethnomusicologists who preserve traditional music through their field recordings. Think of Alan Lomax. From 1937 to 1942, Alan Lomax worked with his father collecting and archiving folk songs for the Library of Congress. In fact, they made over 10,000 field recordings, and they also did oral histories and interviewed musicians. So what Springsteen began thinking of as demos were in fact something much more significant. Stephen Van Zandt recognized that the key aspect of Nebraska was the immediacy of those recordings. When he advised Springsteen not to try to improve on them, he said, "This is going to sound odd, but it should be released as is. The fact that you didn't intend to release it makes it the most intimate record you'll ever do." See, he deserves to be in the New Jersey Hall of Fame. Smart guy. Indeed, folk music is characterized by a lack of mediation between singer and audience. As Bob Dylan discovered, electric amplification could be seen as disruptive to the folk experience because it creates a distance between the listeners and the artist. After observing many specific points of contact between Springsteen's lyrics and the works of other artists, we can start to recognize stylistic elements of folk composition. While these references may not point the audience to a particular antecedent, they can recall multiple models all at once, and even just a common cultural context. Springsteen uses that type of reference in Nebraska to evoke a tradition associated with an earlier time, while applying that tradition to songs that are autobiographical, as in Mansion on the Hill and My Father's House, or that describe recent events, as in Atlantic City, or even draw on a very modern medium, such as film, in Nebraska. For this next one, you can look at handout number 18. In the title song, Springsteen addresses the listener as Sir 4 times, punctuating the song with reminders that the narrator is of a lower status. Parallels can be found in folk songs from the Ozarks, for example, Sugar Hill. This song uses Sir in the same way. Kind stranger, if you'll listen, sir, my name is Ransom Bill, I got my reputation, sir, way out on Sugar Hill. Springsteen also uses non-standard syntax. Me and her, says twice, we done, we had us some fun, and this sort of marks the narrator as lacking in formal education, being from the common people. If you look at handout 19, you see some examples there. In addition to giving that common or colloquial feel to the lyrics, a lot of Springsteen's non-standard morphology and syntax reflect a particular time and place. The album Nebraska contains numerous dialect forms that can be identified as Appalachian English, and that overlaps with the Ozark dialect in the song Sugar Hill. Linguists have noticed ties between Appalachian and Elizabethan English, so the dialect contains numerous archaisms that harken back to an earlier time. All these elements situate Nebraska stylistically in the Appalachia of the early 20th century, although its content takes us from Atlantic City and Mahwah, New Jersey, to Lincoln, Nebraska, to the Canadian border. Bob Dylan is another artist who has used archaizing and dialect forms. Those dialect forms are a way to reference an entire genre and to locate a new work within an established tradition that has ties to a particular time and place. Native speakers of a language have an intuitive understanding of dialect. Even if one cannot explicitly identify we done as an Appalachian dialect form, most Americans would guess that the speaker of the phrase was probably from a rural community. This is because we've internalized a lot of linguistic principles without even realizing it. In other words, we're sensitive to idiom even if we can't recite the rules. In Nebraska, the dialect forms create a thread that runs through the album, placing it in the folk tradition of the southeastern United States. As we reflect on the preceding observations about the way Springsteen composes lyrics, we might wonder how conscious are those techniques, really? Is this just a songwriter who has internalized the music of his predecessors and then it seeps through in his compositions? Fortunately for us, Springsteen has written an autobiography. And while he doesn't comment extensively on his lyric writing techniques, he does describe the principle we've been examining. It's not in terms of lyrics, but in terms of musical solos. One of the final chapters in the book is an elegy for the late Clarence Clemons, the E Street Band's iconic saxophone player. Of Clarence's solos, Springsteen says, "The solos themselves are beautiful. They're simple, elegant, I suppose, but they're not going to win us any blue ribbons at Berklee College of Music unless you understand how difficult it is to create within a framework of limits something slightly new under the sun." Thank you.